Dan Staebell with the Asphalt Paving Alliance, with his area of focus being the north central portion of the United States. So he's going to talk to us about Thinlays, HMA Thinlays.
Again, I appreciate you being here this morning. One of the things that I'd like to do with the group this morning is being very interactive. So I've got a presentation here that involves some interaction from the group. So obviously if you have a cell phone or a smartphone, I want you to enter this information because I'll be asking some questions during the presentation for you guys to participate. So what I want you to do is obviously in the to section, type in 22333, and in the information or the message information, put in Asphalt 1, and you'll get a response that basically says that you're connected to our discussion here this morning, or some kind of response. And this will provide some feedback, both to you and obviously to as I kind of go through this discussion here this morning. So to do this, I put up here just a quick test for you to interact. And the very first one is, what is your favorite steak cut? If you go ahead and respond, we'll see kind of what the mix of the group is here. The last one I was at, I had a presentation involving this discussion, and the ribeye was the favorite of the group. So we'll see if that stays that same way. But as I had mentioned, the Asphalt Pavement Alliance is partners with the National Asphalt Pavement Association and the Asphalt Institute and our 39 state execs, which Brandon Strand is here from Wisconsin, and I again appreciate their support. I'm out of Iowa and cover the upper Midwest. So that kind of gives us an idea. So we'll have a couple of those interactions as we kind of go through here. So I'll appreciate your input as we continue. Well, one of the things that we certainly learned over the last couple days is deterioration happens. Pavements deteriorate as they are placed, and obviously they deteriorate from both weather and loading involved in many years of service, but we know the minute we place them that obviously deterioration does indeed happen. And obviously as we talk about some of those issues of deterioration, a lot of times that pavement preservation that we're talking about obviously happens in that upper side of that curve, if you will. And that's an important understanding of pavement preservation, and that certainly will come out in our discussion here today. But again, we all recognize it, and we just have to know exactly how to deal with it. So one of the things that we certainly mention and always reference is this whole right product, right place, right time mentality. And that always seems extremely easy to just roll off the tongue, and it's extremely difficult to actually manage. So my emphasis here this morning is obviously you guys on the other side of the desk having to deal with that piece of simple discussion is extremely hard to do. So I recognize that and understand that. And so that was obviously talked about and discussed a lot during these last couple of days. But really with this whole focus on the FHWA targets and guidance that's coming out, the Everyday Counts initiative that you're going to talk about this afternoon and tomorrow, I mean, it's really critical. Obviously, there's a major emphasis on this whole pavement preservation end of things. So again, there's a lot to this, and there's a lot of things that are going on. Optimizing this infrastructure. We have, it's been mentioned numerous times, the limited amount of funds that we're dealing with, and we're trying to stretch them over multiple miles. And we don't have enough money to really do what we're after. So adding in this whole pavement preservation discussion certainly compounds that and makes it very, very difficult. But obviously optimizing that infrastructure, knowing when to place these products is really, really important. So doing more with less is a critical element. And as I mentioned in the old Monty Python days, it is indeed the Holy Grail. Trying to get to the Holy Grail of that emphasis is really what we're talking about here. So with all of that, and we've heard a little bit about this, and I certainly want to reference Buzz Powell and some of the other folks that helped me, John Hickey, put some of this information together. Brett Williams, who was here in Wisconsin and has gone to the National Asphalt Pavement Association, have all provided some assistance for me on this. But the NCAT test track has certainly put some things together as far as trying to understand this whole pavement preservation thing. And one of the things that as you go to their website, one of the critical slides that's out there, and I find very, very interesting, is this somewhat simple slide of this distress curve. So one of the things that we talk about, and not only just understanding the right product, right place, right time, but it's also what kind of serviceability, what we are going to get out of that pavement treatment, that preservation treatment. So this slide here, and again it shows like this blue and this red here. One of the things is that it shows that maybe there's a couple of different preservation techniques that can be utilized at that distress elevation, okay, or that distress curve. One of the pieces that you certainly need to understand is that does one of them move them higher into that pavement deterioration curve? Does it bring it higher? Does it provide a certain level of comfort and serviceability to that driving public. So again, that may be another little curveball that's out there, but certainly as we kind of discuss some of the things and attributes of Thinlays, it certainly comes into play as we discuss that overall service life and understanding that. One of the other things that NCAD and Buzz provided to me was some feedback that they're starting to get on the test track that's down there. And one of the things that's extremely important is that of all of the different elements that are out there, the pavement preservation techniques that have been placed on Lee Road and the other sites throughout the test areas down there, is that all of the preservation techniques helped and benefited versus the control section. So that's a critical element. So those things are working. It's a matter of how to measure the performance and how they're actually succeeding in that. So one of the things I wanted to show is that some early information related to cracking is really on the Thinlays and the other several of the sites that have actually provided that and the variations of materials and things. So we are seeing some benefits of obviously placing a Thinlay in this discussion, a Thinlay over some of those treated sections, and showing that they're doing pretty well. They're obviously keeping at bay some of that reflective cracking and the cracking that is underneath. So again, we are actually showing some of those benefits of doing these kinds of treatments. So here we go, we got another question coming up. And one of the diversities that we have in this group is obviously we are all coming from different states and a lot of different backgrounds. So we have a pavement here, and I'll show it here as we go into the next question, but you see some distresses that are there. Certainly some transverse cracking, some longitudinal centerline cracking, maybe even some wheel track distressed on the outside edge. So the question is, what did we do with this pavement? All right, so here at the bottom you've got a couple of different options. Crack seal, chip seal, slurry micro, Thinlay, do nothing. The last one we had about 30 people correspond, but I can get that information. The point that I'm making here is that whole idea of right product, right place, right time. Now you throw in the variable of all of us in this room. We all have a variation of opinion of what we are taking on and dealing with in that pavement, okay? The idea of this is that it's not that easy. It's not a cookie cutter approach to obviously pavement preservation. So there's a lot of different options that are available to take care of that. And the things that I mentioned before, and certainly the things that have been mentioned, is availability of funds. What kind of end result we are looking for. So again, I appreciate the feedback on that. So where are we at on Thinlay? Well, surface mix, basically a hot mix asphalt pavement that's being placed, basically 1.5 inches thick. Some of the newest information, and Danny Gerhardt has an Asphalt Institute, he's an Asphalt Institute regional engineer. In Asphalt Magazine just this month that just came out, had a great article and a recap on Thinlay construction. So if you don't have that, by all means let me know. I'll send you a copy of that publication. But what they did is they went out and kind of investigated what are those surface treatments. And so here you see that the vast majority of them are certainly less than 1.5 inches. A lot of them fall in that 3/4 of an inch to an inch type of category. And one of the things that obviously dictates that surface thickness is the aggregate size. So we're talking typically a 1/4 inch aggregate size, nominal max size, sometimes a 3/8, and that certainly drives that overall thickness that we're talking about. The materials that we're utilizing are hard materials, typically harder limestones. We certainly don't want to have as much breakdown of dust and those kinds of things in those materials. So those are attributes that we are looking at. Typically a higher binder content than our standard mixes. So certainly that participates in the overall costing stride of it. But one of the things that we certainly try to do is correct some of the slope and maybe some of the rideability, and that was talked about by the two doctors yesterday afternoon. They talked about some of the performance that they are seeing in some of the Thinlays that they were researching. And so some of that was the ability to maybe correct some slight rutting and certainly improve ride. And so that's where we get into some of the benefits that we talk about. User delays that we obviously are always cognizant of, getting traffic up and down the roadway as fast as we possibly can. So that's a critical element. Stage construction, being able to do at night in some applications. We can restore some skid resistance, obviously, with some of the microtexture of aggregates that are out there and are available. Lowering pavement smoothness, that's again a critical benefit of what we're after on utilizing maybe a Thinlay versus maybe some other pavement preservation techniques. And some of the other Thinlay benefits, there's been some work in a document that I'll be sharing with you as well as we kind of finish this. Talks about obviously strength addition, the ability to add some kind of structural strength in some applications, utilizing good tack coat procedures, maybe some micro milling and those kinds of things, but being able to actually add some surface strength that we are after in that pavement. And one of the things that we certainly see is when you get into some channelized top-down cracking, sometimes that's one of the distresses that we want to eliminate. So being able to do that with a Thinlay is certainly there. Another thing that certainly has come out of some of that research, again down at NCAT, is understanding noise variations and things. So one of the measures that they're doing and looking at is noise. So one of the things as we all travel around the country and we're on our cell phones, we're on hands-free, those kinds of things, we certainly can understand noise inside of the cabin of a car or a vehicle, understanding that noise can indeed influence our overall quality of that conversation. If we're doing it safely, hands-free, and those kinds of things, it's important. And so that understanding our attributes and being able to deliver on noise as we build our pavement preservation techniques is critical. And so as we see in here, using a finer or smaller aggregate size does help facilitate that overall noise attribute. So here is kind of the freebie question of the morning. So this was the easy one, all right? So when is the best time to perform pavement and preventative maintenance, okay? So here's the freebie one. When a problem shows up on Sundays, on a planned, measured, and strategic basis, all right, wise guy, and after your car motor stops working. And so it's kind of a cross-referencing on pavement preservation. And obviously, as we talk about the predominant answer of being when it is very much a planned, measured, and strategic basis. And a lot of the tools that you guys were talking about over the last couple of days, making it a planned process helps with the budgeting and understanding what is indeed coming out in front of you. And I see a person actually talks about it when a problem shows up. And so too many times it certainly is in that kind of realm that maybe we are out there as a reactive mode and dealing with some of those kinds of things. So again, thank you for that feedback. Project selection is another one of those critical elements that comes up as we discuss pavements and Thinlays. One of the things that we needed to understand is when is that pavement ready for a Thinlay? And so project selection comes up, as we showed this earlier. Transverse cracking certainly is a project selection piece. It certainly can work, and Chuck Norris agrees with me. And so we can say that certainly that is one of those options. But again, Thinlay, as we get into some structural failures that you see on the outside edge here, maybe some moisture problems that we're dealing with here, maybe not so much. So the FON says absolutely not. We need to address those kinds of things that either some full depth patching, maybe a different process, some of the full depth reclamation things that we talked about this morning as you get into those more pavement rehabilitation types. Again, would a Thinlay, here's another answer that I need your help on. Would a Thinlay, see if we're connecting here, would a Thinlay work for this type of pavement condition? The answer is no. So out of the 24 responses, we certainly are getting the idea of where this is right. Again, we're talking preservation. We're trying to optimize that pavement. How do we get in there and deal with those pavement structures before they really start deteriorating to where they're kind of at that point of no return? So again, a Thinlay, much like some of the other pavement preservation techniques, we are indeed getting in there prior to when they start getting into severe distresses. It's always the more difficult thing to do is to spending money on some of those difficult things, but that is indeed a critical element. A couple of the manuals that I'll show you some resources for is certainly understanding where these pavement conditions. And I thought this, again, coming out of Danny Gerhardt's article from the Asphalt Institute was extremely good and very relatable, if you will, on the different pavement distresses, showing, effective, marginal, obviously understanding what some of those conditions are, and then not appropriate. And again, this table can certainly go back to your pavement condition ratings of your pavements and understanding where indeed some of these treatments can indeed be utilized. This is out of some data that obviously came out in 2016, so it's very accurate and very recent, if you will. Mixed types recommendations. Obviously, we're dealing with a relatively small mixture, small in size, aggregate size, typically 1/4 of an inch, 4.75, 9.5 millimeter, those types of mixes. Warm mix asphalt is certainly utilized in some applications. Again, trying to make sure, especially as we get into later seasonal paving, and we understand that as we lay a thinner section, the mat cools very quickly. So being able to extend some of that ability to manage that, and from a density standpoint, warm mix is certainly utilized. And one of the other pieces of that is when we're placing hot mix over relatively thin, over a bunch of crack sealing sometimes, some of those things can kind of come up through that existing mat. So warm mix can be an alternative to lowering that temperature and being able to address that. Recycled material certainly can be utilized with caution and understanding the parameters of recycled asphalt. Some of the guidelines that, again, I'll share with you, talk about as you start adding more recycled material, obviously addressing binder selection and all those kinds of things. But with some of the finer size of our fractionated wrap in many cases, it's got a large amount of, or higher amount of asphalt content, so it can be a great utilization or tool when we're actually placing these materials down. And from my background in asphalt cement and being involved as a binder supplier with Koch Materials years ago, performance graded asphalt became a really critical element, and it's probably near and dear to my heart. This is a critical element to material design, making sure that you make the right application and select the right binder type. Many applications are going to use polymer modified and polymer modification to address some of the things that we're dealing with. So again, they can assist in maybe a little bit of the cracking issue, but they certainly assist in its pavement stiffness and those kinds of things. So as I mentioned early on, we're dealing with a lot of new information coming out. As we talked about in our arena, the Asphalt Pavement Alliance has really put together good research as it relates to Thinlays. So there's a newer position paper on this. We've got some newer documents. But again, we're putting a good emphasis on the Thinlay materials and understanding the design. And there are a multitude of resources. As I mentioned to you, a new one that just is coming out from NAPA, and I had a few copies, and I did indeed run out. But by all means, if you want this just came out this year, Thinlays for Pavement Preservation. It's the IS 141 from NAPA. There is a link for that. I certainly can provide that link as a PDF document, but it goes through several aspects, a lot more in depth than the previous manual. We again have more utilization of materials and those kinds of things. So these are two new manuals that are indeed updated. Federal Highway has a new one, and I can't read it. It's a NHT-12, maybe you can see it up there. Again, I've got a link for that document. Again, performance prediction equations for Thinlay materials. So again, this one just came out within the last couple of months. So newer information related to this. But as I mentioned, this document here, when to use Thinlays, it goes into much more in depth than that table that I have provided to you earlier, but it is a very good resource for providing when and where to use those that Thinlay material. The materials and mix design information. This was not necessarily in the earlier version, which again was about 10 years old. So they updated this with more current data from a compilation of several states around the country. So providing some gradation controls, obviously understanding the volumetrics that we're talking about, the VMA requirements, obviously getting the right asphalt content is critical to the long-term durability. So again, meeting those expectations and having a resource to provide that is very, very critical. And as I mentioned, the Federal Highway document talks about what can we predict for some performance. And as we heard from the doctor's presentation yesterday, again, we're trying to get and build out a longer durable pavement. When we catch the pavement correctly and we place a Thinlay in the appropriate locations, we certainly can extend that overall life of that pavement, making good use of dollars that we've got, and especially in the cases of where many of us are dealing with minimal dollars to deal with. So how do we make sure that we implement them correctly? Summary, and I've got this document at the booth, and again, I appreciate many of you for stopping by and gathering some of this information, but in summary, we can improve some of the ride quality and certainly deal with some of the noise-related issues. We can maintain a lot of the road geometrics. Certainly in some of our urban settings, that's important. And dealing with pavement preservations in some of those locations, it's critical. Someone talked about guardrail, as we talked about over the last couple of days. When we get into some of those applications, we need to understand that clearance, if you will. So again, laying something relatively thin, but still extending that pavement life is really, really critical. Again, some of the expected performance and some of the reviews are, in that 10-year type of category for what we're dealing with in a performance. But again, that relates to what are we putting it on. It's always critical to understanding that when we look at any expected performance of where we're going with our pavement preservation techniques. A nice looking surface when we're done, it's something pleasing to the public as people are out there driving. We're seeing that we're actually taking care of our pavements, and it's critical to that dollar that they're spending as a funding level, making sure that we're making good utilization of those indeed very precious resources and financial resources. So I want to leave you with this. It may be very hard to see up there, but I'll read it to you. NAPA has done a good job with providing webinars for many institutions and agencies out there. So this is a webinar that's a free webinar that's going to be talking about Thinlays. It's on November 28th between 2 and 3:30 Eastern Time. So if you go onto NAPA's website and you'll see the listing of the webinars, it's one that you certainly can register for. It's a contractor's perspective on Thinlay and in pavement preservation. Hopefully you'll take notice of that and take good use of that resource that's available as well. I thank you very much for your time and patience of being here and enduring the last presentation prior to your final business meeting. And with that, I thank you very much for the time of being here this morning, Todd. So
Go back to the slide that showed the kind of wheel path tracking and what I would call good life extension for the Thinlay.
okay, the one that came from Federal Highway. This one here?
Yeah, so in that one, and I'm a big fan of doing pavement preservation when the pavement's in good condition. And we all know the wheel path example where no was the answer. 25% cracking is kind of, well, if that's percent, that's kind of a poor pavement, but I think you got a pretty good life gain there. And don't call it preventive maintenance, but it could be a very economical fit. You know, I'm just impressed by Missouri's system of under 480 T, how they trying to manage that. It's unbelievable.
Right.
And a Thinlay could be a very cost-effective fix per year, per lane mile to maintain that pavement can come out pretty low.
Yes, and you're exactly right. And back to adding some strength, again, some of that can be strength and or pavement fatigue related. You know, again, always a caution, and you reference that, trying to measure exactly how much you can put on and how much you can defray that actual wheel path cracking. I totally agree. But it's going to be through that learning curve that you've got of understanding what can you endure, and obviously you're dealing with maybe a lower volume pavement. So again, you certainly have a different element there that you're dealing with. So thank you all very, very much, and thank you for participating with me.
The preceding was produced by the National Center for Pavement Preservation. More information can be found on the web at pavementpreservation.org. Additional support provided by Michigan State University.